In the late 1980s, as crack cocaine flooded American cities and headlines focused on New York's kingpins or Miami's cartels, something different was brewing in Philadelphia. In the city's neighborhoods, West Philly, North Philly, and beyond, a secretive new organization began quietly tightening its grip on the streets. They called themselves the Junior Black Mafia, or JBM, and their presence would soon change Philadelphia's criminal landscape forever. Unlike most corner crews, the JBM was more than just a gang. It was an organized syndicate, modeled after the Italian Mafia but born from the city's own rough blocks. The founders, young black men who grew up hustling in Philly's hardest neighborhoods, were tired of being muscle for other people's operations. They wanted more than scraps. They wanted power, respect, and real money. Many of them were sharp, ambitious, and willing to do whatever it took to rise above poverty and chaos. The organization's origins were humble. At first, the JBM was a loose alliance, guys who knew each other from school, basketball courts, or juvenile lockups. But as the money from crack and heroin exploded, the crew became more structured. Leaders emerged, rules were set, and the JBM started absorbing or crushing rivals. They wore gold rope chains, drove luxury cars, and carried themselves with a discipline that separated them from ordinary street gangs. If you were in the game in Philly, you either worked with the JBM or you stayed out of their way. What set the Junior Black Mafia apart was its vision. The leadership established strict codes: no stealing from the organization, no talking to outsiders, and absolutely no snitching. Disloyalty was met with swift, often deadly consequences. They ran drug corners like clockwork, pooling profits and investing in legitimate businesses. Even police officers noticed that where the JBM operated, there was order. No random violence, no sloppy business. But the organization's rise was not without cost. As the JBM expanded, it attracted the attention of rivals, especially the Jamaican crews moving into Philly. Turf wars erupted, bodies dropped, and the city's homicide rate soared. Behind closed doors, leaders began plotting against each other, and the seeds of betrayal were quietly planted. By the dawn of the 1990s, the JBM had become the most feared and powerful syndicate in Philadelphia's drug game, a black mafia with its own code, its own rules, and its own vision for the streets. But as quickly as they rose, the forces that built them would begin to pull them apart, setting the stage for one of Philly's most notorious underworld stories. The Junior Black Mafia's rise to power was fueled by a strict code that set them apart from any crew Philly had seen before. At the heart of JBM culture were loyalty, secrecy, and an unwavering demand for discipline. New recruits had to prove themselves, trust wasn't given lightly, and everyone was watched. Members took oaths to never cooperate with police, and those who broke the rules faced severe, often final consequences. The organization operated in tightly controlled cells, with leaders overseeing different territories across West and North Philadelphia. Orders trickled down from the top, and even street-level dealers understood they were part of something bigger than themselves. JBM invested heavily in appearances. Luxury cars, designer suits, and jewelry weren't just status symbols, but signs of unity and intimidation. At city nightclubs and block parties, their presence was unmistakable, and their reputation for handling business with cold efficiency kept most rivals at bay. But it wasn't just street-level power that set JBM apart. The crew moved drugs in bulk, heroin, crack, cocaine, and powder, using networks that stretched up and down the East Coast. They laundered money through front businesses, paid off corrupt officials, and built connections with other major syndicates. Everything had a price, and if someone tried to cut corners or disrespect the organization, the response was immediate. Tales of enforcers handling problems traveled quickly through Philly, warning others that the JBM wasn't to be crossed. As their influence spread, so did the violence. In 1990, a bloody turf war erupted between the JBM and Jamaican posses vying for control of lucrative corners. Gun battles in broad daylight became almost routine, and innocent bystanders were sometimes caught in the crossfire. The city's homicide rate spiked, and newspapers filled with stories about organized drug rings and mysterious black mobsters. Inside the organization, paranoia grew. The leaders worried about informants and undercover cops, tightening security and trusting fewer people. Some members started making side deals, pocketing extra cash, or even whispering to rivals, all while pretending to follow the code. Loyalty was everything. But greed and fear were beginning to eat away at the JBM from within, even as their legend grew on the streets. The chaos didn't spare innocents either. On July 11, 1989, an innocent bystander named Willie Bowman was killed when JBM enforcer Christopher Dirty Black Laster opened fire on a South Philly street, aiming at a group of young dealers who refused to pay JBM rent for working on their turf. Bullets didn't discriminate, sometimes they just found whoever happened to be in the way. Even within the inner circle, loyalty was never guaranteed. On August 10, 1989, JBM Lieutenant Donnie D. Bone Branch, a bodyguard to boss Aaron Jones, was killed during a failed hit on Jones by the Haynes crew. Power, money and fear had turned friends into targets, and the city into a battlefield. By 1990, more than a dozen gangland murders had been laid at the feet of the JBM and its rivals. The streets of Philadelphia ran with blood, the code of silence crumbling as desperation and suspicion drove men to betrayal. The violence was no longer just about drugs or territory, it was about survival, and as the JBM's enemies closed in, so too did the law. The next chapter would see the beginning of the end, for the organization, and for an era of Philadelphia history defined by loyalty, fear, and bodies left behind. By 1990, the constant gunfire and rising body count in Philadelphia's drug underworld had become impossible to ignore, even for those who'd tried to look the other way. The Junior Black Mafia, once untouchable and united, was now under siege from both its rivals and itself. Every murder, every betrayal sent ripples through the city's criminal landscape, and the trust that once bound the JBM together began to fracture. Inside the organization, paranoia spread like wildfire. Leaders worried about snitches, wiretaps, and undercover cops. Members who'd once sworn oaths of loyalty started to look out for themselves, some pocketing drug proceeds, others secretly cutting deals with law enforcement. Old friends became enemies overnight, and rumors of assassination plots and internal coups fueled an atmosphere of constant tension. The violence wasn't just about controlling street corners anymore, it was about settling old grudges and eliminating threats from within. Meanwhile, federal law enforcement watched the carnage unfold and quietly built their case. Undercover agents infiltrated the outer edges of the JBM, gathering information about its leadership and operations. Surveillance teams recorded meetings, traced money trails, and pieced together the links between seemingly unrelated murders. The FBI and DEA began working with local police to map out the syndicate from the inside, relying on flipped associates and small-time members who'd been caught up in raids. On the streets, the old order was falling apart. The JBM's iron grip loosened as rival crews took back corners and launched their own attacks. The power that had once made the JBM legends now marked them as targets, not just for enemies, but for anyone desperate enough to save their own skin. And through it all, the city's homicide rate kept climbing, each new killing a signal that the days of the Junior Black Mafia's reign were numbered. The era of coded loyalty and silent obedience was giving way to fear, betrayal, and the slow, relentless pressure of the law closing in. The collapse of the Junior Black Mafia was as dramatic as its rise. After years of bloodshed and betrayal, the organization's once tight-knit code of silence began to crack under pressure from relentless law enforcement and mounting paranoia within its own ranks. Federal agents and local police coordinated one of the city's largest investigations. Informants, many of them former JBM soldiers or rivals desperate for lighter sentences, provided detailed testimony about murders, money laundering, and the inner workings of the syndicate. Wiretaps captured coded conversations between leaders, exposing plans for hits, deals, and desperate attempts to outmaneuver both rivals and the police. In 1991, the authorities struck. Raids swept through West and North Philadelphia, rounding up dozens of JBM members and associates. Aaron Jones, the JBM's feared boss, was among those arrested. The indictments included racketeering, drug trafficking, and a long list of murders. The courtroom drama that followed gripped the city. Prosecutors painted the JBM as a criminal empire run with military precision and fueled by greed, power, and fear. As the evidence mounted, the JBM's defense unraveled. Former enforcers and lieutenants testified against their old friends, describing murders carried out for debts as small as $100, or the mere suspicion of being an informant. Stories emerged of orders given and lives ended over whispered rumors, missed payments, or turf disputes. The convictions were sweeping. Aaron Jones and several top lieutenants received life sentences, and the organization's leadership was effectively dismantled. The city's newspapers declared the end of the JBM era, but on the streets, the damage lingered. New crews rushed in to fill the power vacuum, and for many neighborhoods the scars of violence, addiction and betrayal would last for generations. The story of the Junior Black Mafia became a cautionary tale. How a group that promised brotherhood and discipline became consumed by greed, paranoia, and the relentless grind of street justice. For law enforcement, it was a victory. For the community, it was a painful reminder of how power, unchecked, can destroy everything in its path. The fall of the Junior Black Mafia marked the end of an era, but its legacy haunted Philadelphia long after the last verdicts were read. With the JBM's leaders locked away, and its organization shattered, the city's drug trade did not disappear. It simply splintered. For many in the community, the scars ran deep. Families mourned loved ones lost to street executions, addiction, or prison sentences that grew out of the JBM's relentless rise. Older residents remembered the brief, uneasy order the JBM enforced, corners where violence was forbidden and dealers answered to higher-ups. But that order was gone, replaced by chaos and uncertainty, the sense of betrayal from within, and the reality that so many were willing to testify to save themselves left wounds that never truly healed. Law enforcement learned from the JBM era, using the RICO statute and new surveillance tactics to target other criminal organizations across Philadelphia. The case became a model for federal prosecutors, and a warning to street crews who thought no one could touch them. But for many, the lesson was bittersweet. Removing one syndicate simply opened the door for others, and the root problems of poverty, neglect, and broken trust remained. Decades later, the story of the Junior Black Mafia still echoes in Philly's neighborhoods and in hip-hop tracks that reference the syndicate's code, power, and downfall. The legend of the JBM is both a cautionary tale and a grim badge of street history, a reminder of what happens when loyalty, ambition, and violence collide in a city fighting for its soul. For the families, the survivors, and the city itself, those lessons still matter. The ghosts of the JBM era linger in the empty lots, whispered stories, and hard-earned wisdom of Philadelphia's streets.